Picture this. Late night at a convenience store. Masked person walks in, pulls out what looked like a gun, and tells the cashier to empty the register.
Classic robbery scene.
Right.
Yeah.
Seems pretty straightforward. But even this basic example, it shows how the Canadian Criminal Code gets pretty specific about what actually defines robbery.
2 key elements.
Yeah, hit me with them.
Okay, so you got to have a threat or use of violence and the intent to steal.
Okay, so in our convenience store holdup, the violence part seems obvious.
Yeah, I mean, brandishing what appears to be a weapon,
Right.
that's definitely a threat. But here's the thing. It doesn't even have to be an actual weapon.
Really?
Yeah, a verbal threat. Even just implying that violence is possible, that can be enough. It's all about how the victim perceives the situation.
So, like, even if the robber is bluffing,
Uh-huh.
say it's a fake gun,
Right.
it's still considered a threat of violence.
Absolutely. It's that fear factor. Potential for harm, even if nobody gets physically hurt.
Gotcha. Okay, what about the intent to steal? In our scenario, it's obvious, but is it always that clear cut?
Not necessarily. Imagine someone breaks into a house, gets spooked, runs off empty-handed.
Right.
Didn't actually steal anything, but they went in there planning to. And that intent, that's what matters legally.
So even a failed robbery is still a robbery.
You got it.
Wow. Okay, so we've got these 2 key elements, but the criminal code?
Yeah, it actually lays out 4 specific ways.
4 ways.
Yeah, 4 ways robbery can actually happen.
It's not just someone mugging you on the street.
Nope. Lots of different scenarios can lead to a robbery charge.
Okay, so break it down for us.
All right, so the first one we kind of already covered. Stealing with violence or threats of violence, your classic holdup.
Okay.
Then there's stealing from someone and either before, during, or right after assaulting them.
So the timing of the violence is important here.
Exactly. Like if someone picks your pocket and then punches you to get away.
That's robbery, not just theft.
Exactly, because the violence is connected to the stealing.
Got it.
Then you have assaulting someone with the intention of stealing from them.
So even if they don't get anything, the intent is enough.
Yep.
Interesting.
Okay, what's the 4th one? Stealing while armed. So basically having a weapon or what seems like a weapon during the robbery.
Like in our convenience store example.
Exactly.
Okay, 4 scenarios. Robbery, however it happens, it's treated super seriously by the police, right?
Absolutely. It's what they call a strictly indictable offense.
Meaning
the police have a lot of power to arrest someone they suspect of robbery.
makes sense.
Yeah.
But what do they need to actually make an arrest? What are they looking for?
They need reasonable grounds.
Reasonable grounds.
Yeah. It's got to be more than just a hunch. They need some solid evidence to back up their suspicion.
So witness statements, things like that.
Exactly. Security footage, anything that points to the suspect as the one who did it.
Right.
And even then, it's not always a black and white decision.
I imagine there's a lot of judgment involved.
Oh, yeah. There are guidelines, of course, but every situation is different.
Right. Every suspect is different.
Exactly. So it's not just about checking boxes. It's about taking all the info they have and making a call.
A judgment call. Okay, so let's say they do make an arrest. What happens next?
Well, things get even more interesting.
Oh, I bet.
Investigators basically have 2 big goals. Figuring out exactly what happened, so proving those elements of the crime.
Right.
And, of course, identifying the suspect.
Okay, so how do they achieve those goals? Is there like a set process they follow?
There is. The training manual calls it the Assess, Plan, Act cycle.
Assess, plan, act.
Yeah, it's a framework for approaching these investigations systematically.
Right.
First, they assess. What do they know? What do they need to find out?
So gathering all the initial details.
Right. Then they plan. What steps will get them the missing pieces?
Like interviewing witnesses.
Exactly. Examining the scene, collecting evidence, all that.
Okay, so assess, plan, and then act.
Right. They put that plan into motion. And here's the key. They repeat the cycle. They reassess based on what they learned, tweak their plan if they need to, and take more action.
So it's not just a straight line, it's more dynamic.
Exactly. They got to be able to adapt as they go because these investigations can get really complex.
Makes sense. You're dealing with the scene, potential evidence, witness counts, the suspect themselves.
Yeah, it's a lot to manage.
And speaking of the crime scene,
Yeah.
I imagine that's where a lot of crucial information comes from.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about what's obvious at first glance either.
What do you mean?
They got to be super thorough looking for anything that could be a clue, no matter how small.
Give us some examples.
Well, you've got the obvious things. Any weapons used.
Right.
Maybe some of the stolen goods, clothing the suspect dropped.
Like you see in the movies.
Yeah, but it goes beyond that. They'll look for video footage canvas nearby businesses or houses that might have security cameras.
Right.
Even small details about the location itself can be important.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like things that help them reconstruct what happened.
So they're putting themselves in the robber's shoes, retracing their steps.
That's a great way to put it. And what's really fascinating is that sometimes the environment tells a different story than what witnesses might say. So they have to piece together all those different perspectives. That's what makes these investigations so interesting.
Okay, so we've got the physical evidence, the crime scene itself, but there's another big piece of the puzzle, right?
Oh yeah, the human element.
Right. The victims, the witnesses.
Exactly. They play a huge role in these investigations, and the way investigators interact with them is super important.
So let's talk about victims first. What kind of things do investigators need to consider when they're dealing with them?
Well, first and foremost, they got to remember that the victim just went through something really traumatic.
Of course.
They might be hurt, they might be in shock, terrified even.
So making sure they're safe and okay is the priority.
Absolutely. And that's not just physical safety. It's about emotional support, connecting them with resources, making sure they get what they need.
Right, because the impact of a robbery can last a long time,
It really can.
both physically and emotionally.
Exactly. And then there's the part where they get information from the victim, getting their account of what happened.
Which I imagine can be hard if they're still shaken up.
It can be. Investigators got to be patient, compassionate, and good at building rapport to get accurate information,
Right, and it's probably their first time dealing with the justice system.
A lot of times, yeah.
So it's important to make it a positive experience.
Absolutely. It sets the tone for how they see the whole process.
Okay, what about witnesses? They're crucial too.
They are. And this is where things get really interesting. Witnesses often see the same event differently.
Oh, I bet.
They might remember things differently, focus on different details.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle with pieces from different boxes.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for investigators to separate witnesses, interview them one by one, and then compare what they say.
To see if their stories line up.
Right, and also to look for inconsistencies or details that match up.
Because even a small detail could be a big clue.
Exactly. It's all about connecting the dots, finding those hidden patterns. Real detective work.
Sounds like it. So we've talked about the physical evidence, the scene, the people involved. But there's another factor that comes into play, right?
Oh yeah, big one.
What is it?
Time. Time is always a factor in these investigations. The more time passes, the harder it can be to catch the person.
How so?
Evidence can disappear, witnesses' memories fade, the suspect might take off.
So it's a race against the clock.
Exactly. And that urgency that impacts everything the investigators do.
So they have to prioritize certain actions?
Absolutely. They might need to set up a containment area quick, try and catch the suspect before they get too far, call in a canine unit to track them if that's possible. Every minute counts.
Wow, it sounds intense.
It can be.
So much pressure to find evidence and build a case fast. And speaking of evidence, what are the key things they're looking for to prove a robbery actually happened?
Well, remember those two essential elements we talked about, the threat or use of force, and then the theft or attempted theft? They need to find evidence that supports both.
Okay, give us some examples.
So for the threat or use of force, it could be witness statements describing what the suspect did, any injuries the victim has, or the weapon itself if they find it.
Right, so it's not just someone saying, they threatened me. There needs to be something concrete.
Exactly. And then for the theft or attempted theft, they might find stolen property on the suspect or somewhere connected to them. Witness accounts saying what was taken are super important too. And even if nothing was actually stolen, the suspect's actions, what they did leading up to the robbery, that can be evidence as well.
So it's about proving they intended to steal, even if they didn't actually get anything.
Exactly. And all of this evidence, every single piece has to be documented and handled really carefully.
Why is that so important?
It's all about maintaining what they call the chain of custody. Every step of the process, from the moment they find the evidence to when it's presented in court, it all has to be meticulously recorded to make sure it's valid. If there's any doubt about how the evidence was handled, it could get thrown out, and that could ruin the whole case.
Wow, so it's not just about finding the evidence. It's about protecting it, making sure it's admissible in court.
Absolutely. And that attention to detail, that's what makes these investigations so fascinating.
You know what's really hitting me is we've only scratched the surface here.
Right.
There's so much more to uncover about the world of robbery investigations.
Definitely.
Well, let's take a quick pause and then dive back in. We've got a lot more ground to cover. We're back And before the break, we were talking about documenting everything.
Yeah, that chain of custody.
Right, making sure every piece of evidence is tracked and handled properly.
Super important. If that chain is broken, the evidence might not be admissible in court.
You mentioned earlier that the criminal code outlines 4 ways to commit robbery.
Uh-huh.
Do these different categories present unique challenges for investigators?
Oh, they absolutely do. Each category has its own little quirks that investigators need to consider.
Okay, like what?
Well, let's take the first one, stealing with violence or threats of violence.
The classic hold-up.
Right. Proving that violence was involved or even threatened.
Uh-huh.
It can be trickier than you might think.
Really? Why is that?
Well, what if the victim doesn't have any visible injuries?
Mm.
Or what if the threat wasn't spoken directly, but implied through the suspect's actions?
Ah, I see.
So in those cases,
Yeah.
investigators have to rely on other types of evidence, witness statements, maybe security footage that captured the suspect's behavior.
Right, building a case that shows there was a real threat, even if it wasn't super obvious.
Exactly. And then you've got the second category, stealing from someone and assaulting them, right before, during, or after.
The timing is key there.
Yes. Like, let's say someone pickpockets you and then shoves you to the ground while they're running away.
Okay,
That would fall under this category.
because the theft and the violence are connected.
Right. It's a more serious offense than just stealing.
It makes sense.
Then we have the third category, assaulting someone with the intent to steal from them.
So even if they don't actually take anything,
Yeah.
the assault itself,
Yeah.
plus the intention to rob them, that's enough for a robbery charge.
That's right. It all comes down to proving that the assault happened specifically to make the theft possible, even if they didn't end up stealing anything.
Wow, the law is really specific.
It is.
Okay, and then of course the fourth category, stealing while armed.
Yeah, and that one might seem straightforward, but there are nuances there too.
Like what?
Well, like, what exactly counts as an offensive weapon?
Right. I mean, a gun or a knife, obviously.
Of course.
But what about other things?
Well, it doesn't have to be a typical weapon. Anything that's used to threaten someone could qualify.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like a baseball bat, a hammer, even a broken bottle. It really depends on how the object is used and how the victim perceives it.
So the context matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of imitation weapons.
Oh, right, like a fake gun.
Exactly. If someone uses something that looks like a real weapon to threaten someone,
Mm-hmm.
it's still considered robbery, even if the weapon itself can't actually hurt anyone.
Because it's the threat that matters.
Exactly.
This is all so fascinating. It's really amazing how much goes into analyzing each detail of the crime.
It is, isn't it? And it shows you how complex the justice system really is.
Right?
The burden of proof is on the prosecution.
Uh-huh.
They have to build a solid case piece by piece to get a conviction.
Like they're telling a story that convinces the court that the suspect is guilty.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where the training manual is so helpful. It stresses the importance of being thorough, methodical, and objective.
Because ultimately their job is to find the truth.
Right. Absolutely. And sometimes that truth can be hard to get at.
Yeah, especially if there are conflicting accounts or not a lot of physical evidence.
Right. They have to rely on their training, their experience, and their gut feeling to figure out what really happened.
Speaking of the training manual, I was really interested in something you mentioned earlier about the person's offenses details page in their reporting system.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us more about that? It sounded important.
It is. It's basically a form that investigators use to record all the specific details of a robbery.
Okay.
Things like the date and time, the exact location, how the suspect did it, a description of any weapons involved, whether anyone was hurt, all that stuff.
So it's like a checklist to make sure they don't miss anything.
Exactly. It helps keep things consistent across all robbery investigations.
I can see how that would be useful.
Yeah, it is, for a couple of reasons.
Okay, tell me.
Well, for one, it makes it easier to analyze data. Look for trends and patterns in these types of crimes.
Like to see if there are any common factors.
Right. By having all the details recorded in the same way, they can start to see the bigger picture.
Uh-huh.
They can identify high-risk areas, common methods used by robbers, even potential connections between different robberies.
That kind of information could be really helpful for preventing future crimes.
Absolutely. And for making sure resources are being used effectively.
So it's not just about solving individual cases, it's about tackling the problem of robbery as a whole.
Exactly. It's about being proactive instead of just reactive.
Using data to fight crime.
That's a great way to put it.
This is all so eye-opening. I had no idea how much went into these investigations, all the different things they have to consider.
It's definitely more complex than it seems at first glance.
Okay, let's take another quick pause and then we'll come back for the final part of our deep dive. We'll wrap things up with some key takeaways and maybe some things to think about going forward.
Okay, we're back for the final part of our look into robbery investigations.
Lots to unpack.
We've covered so much. The law, the process of gathering evidence, analyzing it all.
It's complicated stuff.
It really is. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is
Yeah.
these investigations, they're way more complex than they seem on the surface.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about catching the person who did it.
Right.
It's about really understanding the crime, what caused it, the effects on the victim, and on building a solid case that will hold up in court.
It takes a lot of work.
It does, and it takes a certain skill set. The
Yeah.
investigators we've been talking about,
They're not just following a script. They're making decisions based on what they know, analyzing tough situations, dealing with people's emotions all the time.
it's definitely more than just, finding fingerprints and chasing suspects.
Exactly. It's about piecing together a puzzle where sometimes the pieces don't quite fit, there are missing parts of the story. They have to use their intuition as much as their training.
That intuition part, that's what I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah.
We focus on the how-to of the investigation. But what about the people
The
involved?
human side of things.
Exactly. What about the trauma the victims go through?
That's a huge part of it. And honestly, the training manual doesn't really address it.
Really?
No. But the investigators themselves, they see it firsthand. The impact a robbery can have on someone, it can be really long-lasting.
Of course, because it's not just about the physical act of being robbed. It's that violation,
Right.
that feeling of vulnerability.
Exactly. And those feelings, they don't just disappear overnight.
It makes sense that supporting the victims, connecting them with the right resources, that's so important.
It really is.
What about the other side of it, though?
What do you mean?
The people committing the robberies.
What?
What leads them to that point?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I bet.
There's no easy answer. For some people, it's desperation, poverty, a feeling of no way out. For others, it might be greed, the want for easy money. Maybe they feel like they deserve what other people have.
So it's not always a simple case of good guy, bad guy.
Not at all. There are a lot of factors that contribute to crime.
Right.
And if we want to prevent it, we have to understand those factors.
It's not enough to just arrest people.
Yeah,
We need to address the root causes.
I agree.
So we've talked a lot about robbery from the perspective of the police, but where does it all fit in the bigger picture?
The justice system as a whole.
Right.
Well, the police, they're just one part of it. There are lawyers, judges, correctional officers, so many people involved.
They're all working together,
They are.
and the police, their role is to investigate, gather the evidence, build the case to present to the Crown Counsel.
Right. So in a way, they're the first step in a long process.
Exactly. And the quality of their investigation, that can have a huge impact on how things play out.
It sets the stage for everything that comes after.
And that's why it's so important for them to be objective.
Yeah.
Follow the facts wherever they lead.
Absolutely. It's about making sure the right thing is done, that justice is served.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything we can on robbery investigations.
I think so.
What are some of the big things you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
Well, I hope they have a new understanding of just how complex these investigations are, how much work goes into them,
Yeah.
and how dedicated the people doing this work are.
Right. And they have to balance enforcing the law with, compassion and understanding.
Exactly.
And hey, maybe a bit of caution too.
Always a good idea.
After all, nobody wants to be the victim of a robbery.
That's true, but I think what's really important to remember is that the more we know,
Yeah.
the more we understand about these kinds of crimes, the better we can protect ourselves and our communities.
That's a great point. And if anyone out there wants to learn more, there are tons of resources available. Online at libraries, through community groups. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to talk about these issues, to be an advocate for safety and justice.
The more informed we are as a society, the better equipped we are to create a safer and more just world for everyone.
I like that. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone.